Yeah, I enjoyed this book. I read it in about 4 days. It kind of flew for me. As Sophie mentioned, it follows a lot of that kind of what you would say the Victorian style ghost story, right? It's very similar to Frankenstein, all that good stuff. I haven't read Jekyll and Hyde, but we should put that on the list.
I haven't read
Um,
Jekyll and Hyde. I haven't read Frankenstein either.
you never had to read Frankenstein?
Never had to read Frankenstein.
Damn, dude. In undergrad, I think I was assigned Frankenstein like 3 different times in like 3 different classes.
Ugh.
Yeah. But anyway, if you're familiar with any of that, like Sophie and I like ghost stories. We've talked about ghost stories before, and kind of, I'll always say, the best horror ideas and ghost stories came out of the end of the Victorian era right there. If you talk of all the big movie like monsters that we kind of talk about now, and yeah, there's like existence of some monsters, like the vampire lore existed long before the Victorian era, werewolf lore, all that kind of stuff, but like the stories around it that are iconic that we go back to all the time, the ghost stories, the kind of even Agatha Christie style like murder mystery drawing rooms, right? That all stems from this era where we're having the kind of first moments of the Industrial Revolution, and we've talked about this when we talked about other writers, the breaking up of villages, right? More industrious, the cities are growing larger. Um, we're developing a somewhat of a middle class with the industrial revolution and all that kind of stuff, and the rich people were just sitting around in these drawing room parlors, right? And everybody knows the story how Frankenstein got written and all that kind of stuff, right? It was like a competition. They were sitting around, it was storming, there was nothing to do but sit by the fire and see who could tell the best ghost stories, right? So they would just tell these stories. Seances, right? This became very big during the Victorian era, and then kind of moved into the modernist era too, right? Like Yates famously did seances with his wife and shit. Very insane shit, like very insane shit. Anybody interested in Yates?
Like Yates
If you
was
look at his
really
later
into the
stuff,
occult,
yeah,
generally.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And like kind of towards the end of his life he went pretty crazy with it, dude. Like he and his wife would literally like do these seances, and he would just like rap on the table, do sound effects there with a little rap on the table, and then he would just write these reams of verse unedited and then like publish them and claim that they were like the words of God and like the spirits and shit.
Good lord.
So insane shit, but like there's also like that's ripe with stories, right? Like that's ripe with stories. Good stories. And this is what Dracula follows, that same formula. Dracula was kind of in like the tail end there. I would say the biggest innovation we have in the 20th century that even remotely comes close to what they did in the Victorian era is the zombie innovation, when we started talking about zombies. And that happened around early 20th century, right? The kind of like the Night of the Living Dead and all those kinds of things, like people being raised up from the dead. But before then, like the
What
ghost,
was the
Dracula.
first zombie literature?
I don't know. I mean, I guess you could argue some rising from the dead type thing. Like, shit, we could go, if you really want to argue with it, we go like Bible stories or whatever. People rising from the dead and, well, walking around but being different. I don't know. But actually calling them zombies and like referring to them as like a specific thing, particularly like the viral outbreak storyline that goes with all the zombie lore, was kind of an early 20th century invention off the tail end of these Victorian inventions where they were like Dracula taking like I said, the vampire lore existed like through centuries before this, right? Like there was always like a ghost story from medieval times, etc., of like this bloodsucker that can transform into bats. But Dracula by Bram Stoker, it gave him a name. So it gave the vampire a name, and now we have like Dracula. Everybody refers to like a vampire as like a Dracula setting. So this pretty much set the tone for all horror going forward, like in the 20th century, etc. And that's not my argument. I mean, you could find that anywhere in scholarship, and I just tend to agree with it. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I think, well, I don't know, is that something really to argue? Like,
I just argue that like the ghost
it's
stories
just.
peaked, and like the ghost stories peaked, and then they
I
kind of
mean,
have
yeah, I
been
think all the biggest examples we have of famous ghost stories or famous monster stories come from that time.
right. That's what I mean. It like
Right.
peaked, yeah, and like Dracula was like the tail end of that. And I've ghost stories have always been like a little kind of sweet spot for me, where like I always appreciate a little ghost, a little supernatural. So I liked that was entering into like the mainstream literary scene at the time, all that good stuff. But yeah, I enjoyed it. Sophie did not.